So welcome, everybody. Thank you all for being here. What? Okay. Take a breath. Welcome, everybody. Let's see, I'm going to talk about the theory of practice of orgone therapy and a few kind of beginning, kind of setting the stage here. This is actually a two-part presentation. The first part is going to be giving a theoretical or talking about some of the major ideas that I work with. And the second part, which will be in the afternoon, is the application of that. And in the second part, I'll be discussing this person that I have seen and giving a little window into some of the initial sessions and what exactly went on in those sessions. Because we can talk theoretically and have these ideas about this and that. But really the essence of therapy is what happens in therapy. And what happens in therapy, as Dr. Lewis was saying, is both very individual to the particular treatment, or particular process, and at the same time has certain commonalities. Those commonalities are the theory. And then, of course, there's the aspect of the unique relationship between two people and the character of each of those people. So the second part is going to be building on the first part, and hopefully, in the first part, I'm going to try to frame what I'm speaking about so that it's applicable to the second part. I want to give you a little advance notice that nothing miraculous happens in the second part. It isn't as if some great discoveries are going to be introduced or made, and so just a warning on that. So that's the first thing. Second thing is I gave a talk here about a year and a half ago, or maybe 2 years ago, on Reiki or orgone therapy. I think it was named a little differently. And I would hate to give you the same talk again. One, because I can't remember it, but also two, because I like to try to keep things a little fresher. It was a little fresher in my mind. So I'm going to attempt to speak about things in a little different way, introduce things in a different kind of style. But if you're interested after this, and that'll be very questionable, in looking at that prior presentation, it's actually on tape. And
Are there any miracles in that one?
that it's on tape. Yes. So, and the third thing is I've been working as a therapist for a long time now, and it seems increasingly longer as the years go on. And two things. It is. Oh, yeah, thank you. It was not just an internal perception that was not grounded in some reality. Okay. And one of the things that I'm struck with is that even though I've worked for so long, lots of times I don't understand what's going on. Lots of times I make mistakes. Lots of times I think I'm on the right track and on the wrong track. And sometimes I think I'm on the wrong track and I'm actually on the right track. And I find therapy to be both exciting but difficult, encouraging and discouraging. It's a living process. And I know in some ways, I think for all of us, we're wanting to find the thing that makes all things work and makes all things right and really, gets therapy to work much better. And I think because I've stayed with this for so long, I'm clearly convinced that this is a good approach, and it's obviously the best approach for me and maybe the best approach for other therapists or you. But it's, it has its difficulties, and so it's a process for me of continually learning, continually exploring and finding out what are my limits and what are another person's limits, and a continual growth process. So that being said, I was also, and the last thing to say is kind of figure out who my audience is here, and we've kind of gone around, and for most of you who shared have said that you've been in therapy, and I wasn't even sure How much of this audience would have been in therapy? You've been in therapy, so why am I even talking about the process of therapy? Because you already know. Really, what is it? So that's the end of my talk.
That's a miracle.
It's a miracle. So,
Phil's happy.
so you already know, at least your own therapy, what it's about, and I'll be interested if people want to share at some point, whether either way I talk about it or what I describe in the latter part is really your experience. I'd be fascinated by it. And the other thing is that I work because the way I work because of who I am in my training. And when Dr. Lewis was earlier saying it would be very fascinating to bring orgonomists together and talk about how they work, I think that would be fascinating. Like one of the things is true about therapy is we work in private, and in the privacy which is necessary, it's necessary for the process to go on, there is an isolation. And so the bringing together of how do we actually do things, which is, I think, and hopefully that's what I want to capture in the second part, is I just want you to capture, this is what my thinking, and this is how I translated my thinking in terms of what I've done. Pure and simple. In my training of therapists, nowadays we work with videotape, which is very common now in the training of psychologists and psychotherapists, and it's invaluable. It's invaluable because it's in those moments. It's in those moments, when Dr. Lewis was saying that what Reich did is Reich made it an interpersonal approach. An interpersonal approach, not something distant, where one could see the other and have face-to-face contact. It's in those moments of contact, that is really where the essence goes on, and that cannot be captured even in the way I describe it. I notice that when I'm teaching, I often do my best when I teach about, and I'll bring up a session that I had the day before, because that's the only session I can really remember in its essence. And we can talk about what happened. But otherwise, it becomes experience distant. It becomes, more and more, and I can't capture that. But really, that's what it's all about. That's what it's all about. So bringing together this theory and then the application of this theory and what happens at the moment that turns the switch, that makes something dead alive, intellectual to experiential, and is moving and alive for both people. So the last thing I'll say before I actually finally get into this talk here, the last thing I'll say is that therapy needs to be a very alive experience and a feeling experience. So for me, I'll find myself crying with clients. Not so overtly that they start putting me on the couch and handing me tissues and stuff like that. But I find myself moved, or I find myself angered, or I find myself in fear. And that's the only way that I and they and the other meet. And to me, that's really what Reich was going for, because the essence of therapy, of course, as we'll start talking about it, is touching life and touching emotions, touching the energy, which is the emotion, which is the life, which is interpersonal. And so much of what we deal with in therapy is really the question of, why have we stopped feeling? Why have we stopped being able to take and recognize our feelings? Why have we stopped being able to move from our feelings to engage the world in work, love, and knowledge? Why has that happened? But the why is not an intellectual why. Like, why? It's why is it happening right now? How is it happening right now? That because of what happened in the past is structured in the present, is happening in the moment. And in this moment, we are not engaging in life. And why is that? How is that? And what can we do together in therapy to alter that? And that's what therapy is, the altering. So this stopping that I'm speaking about is none other than what Reich clearly spoke of as character, right? Character analysis. Step one, as was presented. Character analysis. Character. That which stops us. That's what traps us. Man in the trap. That's what inhibits us. That's what we formed early in our life based upon experience between us and the world that told us in some way, shape, or form how we interpreted the world, that ingrained in us that we must stop. Reich said that stopping was based on fear, right? The linking of fear, the linking of excitation, of movement, of pleasure and engagement with some sort of prohibition, some sort of not being met, which stops us. Not just once, not just twice, not just 3 times, but repeatedly. So that stopping becomes ingrained in us. And ingrained in us not only in our cognitive scheme, because nowadays in psychoanalysis and cognitive therapy and all of those, I mean, it's well known that character exists and character is treated. And it's treated often as a cognitive schema, as a template. It's truly, it is there. But Reich understood later on, and increasingly so, that it's not only in our character, in our schema, cognitive schema, but it's in our whole protoplasmic response. That whole biological, integrated response that we stop ourselves, that we learn we cannot do this. And then, what happens? If it was a simple one-to-one, if it was a simple, okay, we moved, we were stopped. We approached with joy, we were met with scorn. We stopped. We approached with joy, we were met with scorn. We stopped. We stopped. If it was a simple one-to-one, we could do simple one-to-one exposure therapy. Discharge that, and then we're cured. But no, what happens is we approach in one way, we're stopped. But we don't stop approaching. We just start approaching in a different way. In a way that's both we stop ourselves and express ourselves. But that response gets stopped. And also in that process, we have frustration and anger and resentment. And that gets stopped. So there becomes this entanglement of ways that a person begins to start and stop, and start and stop, and move and backward. And this entanglement becomes structured in our interactions and in our biophysically, and is what is called the armor. So because it is this entanglement, therapy becomes a complicated maneuver, a complicated process. Because in a way, as we go one way, and this opens, another thing opens, another thing closes. And so therapy becomes a discovery over time. But a discovery that goes from the outer to the inner to the core. And at the core, I think we all want the same thing. I think if therapy could be completed for all of us, we would all want the same thing and be able to do the same thing. To be able to love unconditionally, fully, biologically, biophysically, intellectually, hold the other emotionally, be held, move through the world. I mean, all that would happen. It's very simple. I think in Morty Herskowitz's book, he speaks about things operating in a straight line. You know, the goal would be things to operate in a straight line. But no, we become divergent. The goal of therapy is to restore that straight line as much as possible. But there are intricacies there. There are the fears, there are the shame, all of those things. So, really, as I think about it in terms of what is orgone therapy? Orgone therapy is the process that Reich developed, a way of undoing character changing character structure, changing those resistances, changing those interpersonal, intrapersonal ways that we inhibit ourselves in our lives. And in the process of doing that, we become more able to function. And as we do that, we're more alive. And as we do that, we have more energy flowing. And as we do that, we feel better. And as we do that, life supports therapy. So a thing that I keep coming back to myself is that therapy is just an aid to life. And I think Reich was, like the river wants to flow, but then there's an obstacle. What do we do as therapists? We remove the obstacle. Okay, but then life flows. And as Dr. Lewis was saying, we help a person structure their lives, or we support them as life begins to move. But essentially, life is therapy. Life is living. And as therapists, we're just working to allow that to occur. So, if I'm saying anything, what I want you to go away with in this is that the thing that is, I see, unique to orgone therapy is that when we're talking about changing character, changing these ways of modes of being in the world, muscular, physical, cognitive, interpersonal, plasmatic, when we talk about that, we've got to address the whole of it. We can't just address the part. So, it's not just addressing the thoughts or addressing the restriction in breathing or the way that we move our eyes or the way we don't move, but the whole of it. And as I was mentioning, I think when I was standing there, in terms of what brought me to see Michael Rothenberg, was that I had an understanding that the way I was learning about Reich's work did not include that. That at that time, I was really struck by, wait a minute, there's something here. How do you really address the whole person? This integrated whole. And I thought that there was some way that Reich was speaking about it that I wasn't getting as I was learning how to address the biophysical, but not the character. Or I was learning how to address, in my psychological training, the character, but not the physical. How do we blend these two? So when Reich speaks about character, there's the psychological behavioral, and then there's the muscular, and later on he talks more about the plasmatic. This is what we're addressing in therapy. So it goes then, by definition, it would go that when you're with a person, when I'm with a person, working in therapy, what happens is I have to keep both of these or all of these elements in mind. There has to be a technique that allows one to focus on these elements. And it interests me that when Reich came to the whole idea of using the couch, of course, he used the couch because that's what it was being used in psychoanalysis. But actually, the use of the couch as a technique in psychotherapy, in orgone therapy, is very important because it allows you as a therapist and it allows the person to engage their somatic self, and you can see their somatic self as a therapist, and they have the freedom to feel it in a way that just sitting up often doesn't have the case. But it has its limitations, and that's why oftentimes there's moving and standing and kind of moving around. But the whole way of bringing a totality of the physical self as the biological self into therapy becomes crucial in an orgonomic treatment. So, part of what I was going to say, if those people who didn't know anything about orgone therapy, is that people lay down on the couch and breathe. You all know that. Okay. But from the perspective of the therapist, I can say, it offers me a different vision than when I'm sitting with the person. It's very fascinating. Because sometimes in my work with clients, I will work with them just sitting. They don't even know. They didn't come in for orgone therapy. What's orgone therapy? What's Reichian therapy? They don't know anything about that. Maybe over time I'll introduce these ideas. And then I'll notice that as we transition from sitting to laying down, a whole window opens up. A whole window of how this person breathes. How this person actually is able to kind of deal with their energy and affect in a way that they couldn't do and we couldn't see and we couldn't address. So the laying down is a very important aspect of orgone therapy. But unlike what I learned as a, quote, Reichian therapist early on, laying down and breathing is only part of the therapy. As a person lay down and breathe, that doesn't mean you don't talk, you don't discuss things, you don't engage with one another. And oftentimes people mistake that. So on the West Coast, where everything is everything, and there's all sorts of different kind of approaches, people will say, I learned about Reichian breathing, and I used to do Reichian breathing. That just makes me shudder inside, because what is Reichian breathing? And of course, Reich used breathing, and I'll come to that in a moment or so. But that Reich's work is breathing. And Reich addressed this. Reich says, oh, they're going to distill my work into working with this segment or that segment or the other segment. But no, breathing is a tool. But really, it's just one tool of engaging the energy, of mobilizing a person. And sure, every, quote, neurotic, which is all of us here, has a difficulty in our breathing to one degree or another that needs to be changed. But that's only one aspect of it. So when you're working in therapy, when I work in therapy, it's bringing all and addressing all of these elements together. A person lays down on a couch, and we'll see this when I talk about my client. But it's a process of doing something somatically, talking about something, having something then help it emerge to move in a somatic frame. But then, hopefully, what will happen is that will bring up a defensive function, a way that a person is organizing their energy and stops their energy or their emotions, which is part of their character. And then you've got to address that. And addressing that is often in terms of the realm of interpersonal engagement. So, I put it to them in my notes, I say a simultaneous or oscillatory work on the somatic and muscular armor, but I don't think that really captures it. I don't think it really, to oscillate means you go from A to B. It's true, you do that. Simultaneous, what does that really mean? It's this kind of way in which you're understanding that energy and life moves and then it stops. And if you can grab on, how did it stop? Right there. And then engage the person around that stopping, that they become aware of the stopping. And then, through that awareness of the stopping, they can unstop. And then they can apply that in their lives. Then you have the process of therapy. So there's a movement, a stopping, a deflection, a misdirection, a way in which we all try to keep ourselves safe in the world. And then, in the process of therapy, because as a therapist, you're trained to observe these things, and so you say, wait, this happens in the world all the time, but no one calls you out on it, except your spouse, or your significant others, and then you say they're all full of shit, But no one calls you out on it, or really recognizes it. But here we're going to recognize it. You stop there. How did that happen? What happened here? Did you even know it? And the even knowing it is important, because as Reich understood, when we have armor, chronic contraction, energetic immobilization, energy not moving, it affects our awareness. Armor stops the energy from moving, and when energy doesn't move, we become less aware. We may be aware of the consequences of it, like my neck is tight, physical consequence, or, I always have to react in a certain way when something occurs, interpersonal consequence. Okay, but we're not really aware of the kind of stopping that kind of goes on. So as we mobilize energy, there becomes this awareness, and then if you bring that awareness, that's part of the process of it being undone. Because bringing awareness then moves energy. All these things, really, and that's why I say therapy is life and life is therapy. Because really, I see another idea that I have is like, we're changing, doing orgone therapy is changing this to this. What does that mean? Well, it's a magic trick. You just do this. No. It's changing this, which is a grinding in on oneself. A grinding in on oneself. A compression of oneself. Life is going in this way, to spinning it the other way. And as you start spinning it the other way, it gains momentum. Over time, the energy starts to move. People start to change. They change in their lives. They do things differently. It engages them. And then they go like this. From here to here. But the person has to become aware of this. And then have the energy enough to move into this. So, a person comes into therapy not knowing about this. Very rarely a person comes in and says, I want to really do a character analysis. My character sucks, and please help me change. I'd say, okay, you're half done. Okay. No, this is not. people come into therapy because of the result of this. I'm depressed. I'm anxious. I have physical problems. I have, panic. I have a symptom. They don't know that this is at the root of the symptom. And very often when a person comes into therapy, they don't really even want you to address this, right? Who wants? That's what Reich discovered, right? Start addressing this, people get pissed off. Well, I'm still pissed off that it was addressed. Why? This is part of who I am. Please, don't touch me, please. But get rid of this. But as Reich well understood, you can't really get rid of this. The symptom. You've got to get rid of that underlying character process, the energy that's bound, the way that the person structures in order to change. So, person comes in with symptoms. In the process of therapy, what the aspect of therapy is that a person leaves and is able to say, and not just leaves at the end of therapy, but leaves during the therapy, that these symptoms come from this. And these symptoms that come from this, and I understand this, and that is why I have these symptoms. And as energy moves differently, these symptoms change. And I've seen that enough, even in my struggles in therapy, and even in the long times that therapy doesn't work. I've seen it enough to know that as a person is able to change the way that their armor is, and every manifestation of that, or many manifestations, even some small manifestations, symptoms go. Not that they never come back, right? Because this process of armoring reoccurs, but they disappear. And then when they reappear, they're easier to disappear. And as I go back and forth like that, that's another movement aside from this, is that what you're doing in therapy is you're restoring the capacity for pulsation, right? To be able to expand and contract and expand, to deal with life. Stock market goes up, the stock market goes down. You have money, you lost money. You were in a relationship, you're not in a relationship. You thought you knew something, and now you know you don't know anything. Okay, but to deal with this requires a kind of flexibility, an ability to respond in a lively way to the natural adversity in life. And this becomes the goal of therapy. This is pulsation. Now, again, going back, that as we talk about this pulsation, this is the same pulsation that you see in a person's breathing, in the way they're able to mobilize energy and mobilize emotion. And as you begin to help a person do that, they are able to withstand this. They become, their ego, in an earlier psychoanalytic language, becomes stronger. So, this is what the process of therapy is working with all of that. So I have a few things. How am I doing? 11:45? What?
I'll give you 5 minutes
Oh,
before
I
12.
need
so
more
you
than,
got plenty of
give me 15 minutes. Okay, 11:45. How we do that, let me add a few elements to this. Is as you're engaging a person in therapy, as I engage a person in therapy, what are you trying to help them do? What is this? What is this? What is this all about? You're helping a person increase, tolerate more feeling and aliveness in life, in therapy. That's one of the things you do. The second thing you're doing, and you're helping a person change elements in their life structure that prohibit that. So, the term life structure is not something that Reich used, but Reich clearly spoke about how, in fact, we, in our armoring, create societies which then armor us. Okay? So, in other words, we move to a kind of stasis. Stasis in ourselves and a stasis in the world which supports our stasis. Well, we don't only do this on the macrocosmic, societal level. We do it on each level of society. And the smallest level of society is our dyads, and then our triads and our families, and our friends and our work. And we develop a life structure. And oftentimes it's that life structure that is keeping us immobilized. So in the process of therapy, what happens is that as we change, we have to change our life structure. In fact, our life structure begins to change And I think as Dr. Lewis was kind of alluding to, what happens when you have to change your life structure, but society at large doesn't allow that to happen, there's a big struggle that goes on. So part of what happens is as you increase your contact, your ability to feel more emotion, to feel more aliveness, and move toward the world in that kind of way, then things are going to be challenged. Then things have to change. Systems have to change. And that's what occurs. So, I'm talking in kind of general terms, and I'm talking in some way specific. But the whole process that when Reich moved from character to biophysical is that he understood more increasingly how you work in therapy in terms of freeing up this energy. First, you work in therapy and freeing up this energy. He did by attacking the character, slamming it, coming. But then he saw, and why did he do that? Because he wanted more emotions. He wanted it to be more alive. He wanted to get the negative transference, the energy that was bound in that to come forth. But then he saw that other ways could be utilized, the biophysical approaches, the vegetotherapeutic approaches. So that's where there was the use of the breathing. That's where he began, and we begin to directly use biophysical hands-on contact where structure becomes stuck. That's where you use expressive emotions, expression of emotions, having people make faces and hit and all those kind of things. That becomes part of the therapy. Not as an end in itself, not because it's fun, because usually therapy is far from fun, though there can be a great deal of pleasure that comes through the unfun of it. But the fact is that you've got to engage the total stopping. And so part of therapy is that, as Reich was doing it, is that he began to systematize that. And he noticed a few things. He noticed where you armor yourself. And then we, as ergonomists, speak about the segments. You all probably know about the segments, but I'll tell you something. Only people who are involved in Reich's work know about the segments, or think about the segments. You know, there are a lot of somatic approaches out there, and some of them have introduced some very interesting ideas, because we're all alive and no one has to, like to check on the truth and so on and so forth. Well, there's a lot of interesting ideas out there, but they don't really understand the segments. And really understand it's a key element in terms of working segmentally and how segments work with one another and how, in a biophysical sense, you see the way this tree, this starts here and the eyes open here, and a client will say, oh, I feel my eyes are opening. Oh, I notice I can't breathe now. Oh, I'm going to breathe now. Oh, I don't see a damn thing. Okay, how these segments work together in the same way that we move one way and we move another way and we stop. So the introduction of Reich into a segmental approach helps, again, the therapists organize themselves in their work with clients. Doesn't rigidify it, because I think it was, there has to be, I don't know where I read this, but some article either in one of the old ergonomic journals or something like that. Well, we'll massage the head segment, and then we'll go to the jaw, and then we'll go to the throat, and you work down in this kind of way. And it kind of, and you say, well, theoretically, right? You have to free the energy from up and above and stuff like that. But again, that's a mechanical misrepresentation, misunderstanding of Reich's work. And yet, the whole way that energy flows and is expressed and emotions get expressed are all part of this understanding of things. So, as you work from the outer inner, from what happens in the moment to what happened in the past, you're working simultaneously in terms of opening up these different segments. And you're working together. Now, the thing that Reich carried through with character analysis is that you do work from the present to the past. There's a lot of therapies that like to go to the birth trauma. I don't know, I missed my birth trauma, but I'm sure it was traumatic. Okay. I have no doubt about it. And I think the next year was traumatic too. Okay, just a kind of, right, exactly. Okay. But whether or not things I do right today directly reflect my birth trauma, which they may to some degree, and whether or not if I go there, that's going to change things, that's a question. However, if I start dealing with things between how it's happening right now, that I can't look you in the eye, that as soon as emotion starts to come up, I have to look away, or I have to stop my breathing, or I have to go into some sort of ideation about what I think I'm feeling because I don't want to feel what I'm really thinking. As you go from there, then you work your way back to the birth chart. But you've got to go that way. What?
And it doesn't matter.
And it may not matter. Perfect point. Because what Ralph said is that really the past, the only reason for going to the past is to undo how it's anchored in the present. It's really in the present that we have to deal with. And we know increasingly that, you can kind of, and that's where primal therapy, that's where I left primal therapy. I mean, I could have primaled from today to tomorrow. In fact, if you want a demonstration, I will. Yeah, but today to tomorrow isn't the tomorrow I want to create. Okay, so it's when you work in the present, when you work in that way, in the totality of it, then you move from the. So you're working segmentally to free up a person's energy. You're working from present to past, and you're working from the moment and now, and you're gradually doing anything you can within a context that allows for this aliveness to occur.
You get about 5 minutes
5 minutes.
before the Q&A.
Okay,
if you
great.
want to do that.
Great. So, does that kind of get that sense of that? Kind of get that sense. So, 2 things I want to speak about just toward the end, or maybe 3 things about, is that one is this whole thing about respiration. You all know about this. Why am I telling you about this? Well, I'll pretend you don't know. Okay? Here's my pretending you don't know. Okay? It's very important to deal with breathing in therapy. Okay? Now, but differently than a lot of other therapies deal with breathing. I mean, we know. It didn't take right to discover anything about breathing. And we know that we can regulate our emotions through breathing. In fact, we know that if we do certain things with our breathing, we can change our psychobiological state. Okay? We know that. And so we, as cognitive animals, we can regulate that, and we can apply technique, and we can train ourselves. But that's not what Reich did with breathing. Breathing had nothing to do with training of breathing. And this becomes a misrepresentation of the Reichian breathing. Breathing, every emotion has its own breath. Every movement has its own breath. When you're scared, you have a breath. When you're excited, you have a breath. When you're ashamed, you have a breath. When you're angry, you have a breath. Every breath has its breath. And really, if you're going to free up the person or free us up as much as we can to engage life, the breathing has to be able to respond to life. And that's what the work with the breathing is. You use the breathing, or I can't speak to Reich because I never spoke to him. Okay, I can't speak for what he would say. But I use the breathing, one, to build energy, to allow for excitation, but also free the breathing so that a person has their breath to support their life. So, when a person is about to cry, and it's important to cry, not all the time, I don't want to start crying right now, okay. But it's important to be able to cry when you're sad. And if you stop your breath, and your breath can't support a cry, you can't cry. And if you can't cry, you can't breathe. And if you can't breathe, you may not be able to love. And if you may not be able to love, you may not have connections with people in the world. So, we've got to have breathing that supports a cry. We have to have breathing that supports an angry assertion. We have to have breathing that supports a letting go in pleasure. The orgasm reflex, the orgasm of letting go. So that's what breathing is about. It plays a central role in orgone therapy. And as we know in terms of segments, it comprises 3 segments, but actually when you talk about breathing, breathing comprises the whole body. The whole body moves when you breathe. So every segment is involved in breathing. That's what makes it so unique. So breathing becomes a central focus in therapy, but as a focus, it's the focus of freeing your breathing, just like you're freeing any other segment, so that there's a life in it. Okay, so that's one thing to talk about, breathing. And you'll see in my case presentation or discussion how I utilize breathing, which again, don't wait for it really. But you'll see how I utilize breathing in the way. What's that? Don't hold your breath. Exactly. Right. How I utilize breathing and how it becomes significant in this. Okay. The second thing is this thing that I don't know, and maybe we could actually talk about historically when Reich brought this in. because I don't think it was the beginning of when he discovered digital therapy, but the whole focus on the eyes and the ocular segment, okay? Which is another thing that, in a sense, I don't really see really talked about in other therapies, somatically oriented therapies, in the way that Wright did. You know, really the importance of eyes and ocular contact. And I think when Reich first brought this on, he understood with the birth of his son, you know, that the children actually make contact with their eyes very early on. He was taken by that. And of course, that's all old history, and we know that. And there's so much that we know about neonates and that Reich didn't know, clearly. But the importance of working with the eyes and contact and emotion and emotional expression through the eyes as one point of contact, not the only. You know, the other thing is how we touch and how we move and how we feel, how we hear, tone in our voice, all of those aspects. But these whole areas of contact, ways we contact the environment and ways we block contact in our sensory system became a very important part of orgone therapy. And it really is around the whole idea of how we connect both to ourselves and others. So a lot of work in orgone therapy is done working with the eyes. But really, if you think about it, working with the eyes is really working about seeing. And there are many ways we see. And it's not only seeing is not just a mechanical process, but seeing is an emotional process. If someone says to you, I see you, okay, oftentimes you're not going to think, oh, they have the outline of my physiognomy right there, and they could capture it if they were really good artists in terms of this sketch. You feel something different when a person says, I see you, because it's I know you, I take you in. And I think that's part of the ocular segment. I think that's part of being able to take you in, the other in, and take yourself in. How many of us really see ourselves? Isn't that what therapy is? You go to therapy to be able to see yourself through the eyes of the other. Okay, that's why it's important as a therapist, as much as we can see and we can reflect. That's what helps our clients. That's what helps our partners. That's what helps to be seen through the eyes of the other and to be reflected accurately. That's how we grow, right? Attachment. So the focus on the ocular segment became very important for Reich, but not just as a mechanical thing, and it becomes crucial. And I would say that the first turn that Reich did, the first turn of sitting adjacent to the person rather than behind them, is the first beginning of having this seen. It's very hard to be seen either by the back of someone's head or to see them when you can't see them directly. So, all of this work in terms of engagement and stuff, 1 works with respiration, 2 the ocular segment, and 3 then all the segments. And what are we attempting to do? I'll just repeat it. We're attempting to bring life into all of the segments, but I don't even say bring life is wrong. Life is there. We don't have to bring life. We just have to stop the blockages to life. And then what happens is that people engage in life. Okay? And then that's the this. Okay. The this or the this? It's the this. It's the this. And that's the exciting element. Okay? That's when some of the hard work pays off because the person says, I did this, and this is what happened. But then what does the person say? And it's scaring the shit out of me. Yes. Right? And then you work with that. Okay. And then you move from this to this. And then life takes over. And eventually, when life takes over, therapy becomes less necessary. Now, of course, for Reich and for us, the goal is orgasmic potency, which is very hard to achieve. The result, the orgasm reflex, to be able to surrender fully with your respiration, your whole organism, into that kind of surrendering pleasure. Sometimes you see it with clients, sometimes you don't. But for me, if you can see this turn to this, and a person leaves therapy structuring their life and then calls you up, a year later, and they come back for a little bit of a tune-up, and their life is very different. And I'll say to them, wow, you're having some difficulties now. But would you have ever imagined 4 years ago, or 6 years ago, or 8 years ago, or 2 years ago, that we would be talking about this? And then you say, you're right, I never would have thought that, I never would have imagined that. Because we can lose perspective. That's the gratifying.
Great.
Okay?
Thank you.
Okay. Good.
Let's give primacy a place to those who didn't get to ask questions the first time around, and then anyone else want to ask questions. So who has a question for Dr. Schiff? Please, go ahead.
Do you find that, this is a general question, and I know that it doesn't pertain, everything's individual, but we were talking about full, being free fully and going out into an armed society is like so terrible, you're going to get killed. So do you find that to take somebody like a little bit of the way, is more successful long term for that to be sustained than to try to do more?
Well, one, I think things do take time. It does have to be slow. And I think it also depends on what the person is already coming in with. But I don't know, I think that if a person over time develops healthy relationships and builds structures in their life, it can be less, like this, like I'm walking from, suddenly I was in this protected environment and then I walk out and, life is about to kill me. I don't know if it has to be like that, but then there are limits. And these are the limits where people say, well, yes, there could be more life here, but it's going to cause too much struggle. It's going to be too difficult for me to really want to take on this challenge, whether it's a challenge of changing a work or changing a relationship or, or changing whatever. Sometimes those things are too challenging because society doesn't hold it. And then people make these kind of decisions.
And it would feel more frustrating then at that point, having to be free, saying, I'm compromising my as opposed to when I was armored.
Well, you could say that, and maybe that's a truth to a person, but on the other hand, it is something different when we have a choice. People come into therapy feeling that they don't have choice. And because they don't have choice. Because armor is characterological and you don't have choice, right? The nature of armor, right?
That's right.
Okay. But when a person has a choice, it changes things. They may resent their choice, but they know they made the choice. And we've all got to take responsibility for what we do in the world. And I think freedom is taking responsibility. So I'm not so sure about that. Maybe in a sense it is harder. Maybe ignorance is bliss, but there's another side to it. Might say. Yes.
I have a question.
I'm sorry.
You mentioned going the traditional Reiki method is to go from the head down, and you're saying that that's not followed so much anymore. So I was wondering if there was some commonalities found between types of patients that would come in and working with different segments. It's not simply head.
Okay. If you heard that, I'm sorry, I misrepresented myself. I don't believe, I didn't say that it's not done anymore. I said that it's misunderstood. Mm-hmm. If it's done in a mechanical way, it's not done anymore because it was never done or never supposed to be done. Okay? But it's in that sense, so it is done. It just was misunderstood. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A question which is very closely related to that question about how you go in sequence or not in sequence with segments. In character analysis, Reich says, I think I'm reading him correctly, that every patient has a central character defense, which is expressed in the character style and the character structure, and that at least early on in what was then analytic treatment, you would focus, very much on that central trait.
Right. Yes.
And that, in fact, could be understood and eliminated, and that was really key to the success of the major treatment. So my question is, in working with Orgone therapeutically, energetically, do you also find that there's a central character trait which might conceivably be reflected in the central, in a more It's the importance of a certain segment
Yes.
of armoring,
Yes.
which needs to be addressed early on.
Okay. Yes, yeah, yeah. No, but I'll elaborate on it because that was a quick answer. Yeah. That in fact, there are these central themes. There are these central character themes. I mean, you might want to then say, well, you can type, say, well, that's pretty, you would think that because this person's compulsive or this person's hysteric, so they use certain kind of things. But every person, we do have these central ways in which people move and stop themselves in the world and around certain issues. So there's one client that I'm going to talk about. She has a number of things, and in the course of your initial work, you find those out. These things become discovered. You can't just, you find them out as you start tweaking it. But like I'm afraid to be assertive. And my fear of being assertive, a lot of people can be afraid to be assertive. But how do they do that? Do they do it because they can't show assertion in their eyes? Or because they show assertion in eyes all the time? Right? And in that, they kind of ward people off so that people stay away, so therefore they never have to truly be assertive. I mean, the way that a person does it is unique, but that becomes discovered, and that becomes a red thread, a central kind of thing. Is it located in the eyes, or in the respiration, or in the throat, or some combination there and thereof, usually? And as you're saying, it could be maybe more localized in one place or more typified, but yes, you do find. And that becomes something that I found in therapy, as Wright did, and maybe because I was influenced by Wright, so that's why I find it, and it's all because of how I'm being oriented to look, is that you take this central theme, and this theme reoccurs again and again and again. Even as you go, quote, down the segments. A runner will run. A fighter will fight. A collapser will collapse. Okay? To put it in a way. Yeah.
I just want that in terms of the segmental arming you're working down, is that what you need to keep in mind is that you're always, when you're working as a therapist, you're clearing through. So you might not, you might, usually what you need to address is that there's usually an initial exam.
Yes, I will. Okay.
And we'll talk more about that. So, you get a sense after a point that, well, someone can come in and can cry very easily.
Yeah.
And so, and they can be offended when you say, well, I don't want you to cry anymore. And they say, well, why not? I want to cry. Well, you don't have to cry. You're not blocked. Your crying is not a problem, but it covers up. So again, it's not that you don't work down.
Right.
What I think Dr. Schiff is addressing is, and it particularly comes from, we're going to talk about that later, Dr. Baker's book, which tends to be extremely mechanical. Okay, and says you do this, you do this, you do this, you do this, and you get this result and this result. And the fact of the matter is, it doesn't really work. Works sometimes, and that's dangerous. Works a lot of the time until it doesn't work. And for any therapist, for those of us who that do orgone therapy know, any therapist who goes mechanically, you wind up, or does psychoanalytic treatment mechanically, you get to a point where all of a sudden it doesn't work. And then what do you do? And that has to do with the nature of the way therapists are also armored and stuck. So just keep that in mind.
Excuse me. Thanks for your presentation, Dr. Schiff. I have a question about, in character analysis, Wright talks about the different character types,
Yeah.
about narcissistic.
Yeah.
Do you find in therapy that those kind of bleed into each other, that's not that rigid, or over time, do you think that's changed?
Okay.
How?
Okay, good. Two questions. One, if my reading of character analysis is he would speak about these are ideal types. Okay, these are ideal types, but in nature, meaning us, in nature you don't find often ideal types. You find types with various other manifestations. So there's, you have an ideal kind of a central movement, but there's a lot of variation in it. And I think the way, speaking about Ellsworth Baker, and I think the way he presents it, or it's presented in some of the journals, is that you can have a certain kind of character structure, but then you can have a character structure with an eye block, or you can have a character structure with more heavy oral blocking. And that comes from Reich as well. There's the phallic with the oral block, or the hysteric with the oral block, which is going to change the presentation, okay, and change the way the person feels and functions and lives in the world. Okay. So I don't think, so yes, so I do think you see that, but in the same way that Wright, or the way I read Wright, you don't see these pure, you see these you see how it all kind of plays itself out. Everyone has their own history, and even if you have the same character, that doesn't mean you have the same history, obviously. And the second thing, are there new types? In reading character analysis, I think somewhere, because I've been teaching now, and we've been going through character analysis, so it's a similar kind of process, and rereading it. Reich even there says, these are the character types I have now, there'll be other character types. Yes, there are other character types, and that's the way it is. He also says something which really struck me, which struck me too, is that as a therapist, as you're greeted with character types that you don't know, you're more apt to make mistakes. I raise my hand.
Well, just a quick anecdote. When I saw Dr. Sobey, at the end of the very first session, he named my character. He says, "You're a this with a bit of a this." And I don't want to tell you what he said. And,
that later on?
No. And then he never mentioned that again. So he had seen it, he had nailed it, he had even told me what it was, because he knew I was up in my head and reading all this stuff. And that was the end of the discussion.
Yeah. Right.
Well, I was wanting to pick up on what Dr. Lewis mentioned in terms of the character structure of the therapist. So
Yes.
how do you, maybe you can talk about this in the second half, in terms of how do you stay open and moving and flowing in terms of not letting it affect, not letting your own armor affect your therapy?
That's my therapy, not my wife, or that part of my life.
Yeah.
Well, I think the way you do it, or the way I do it, as best I can, and clearly I emphasize the as best part, is that, again, it's the part of that awareness. If you're aware of it, it gives you some sort of control. And you can kind of, so there are certain people, certain clients that I work better with than others. And there are certain little hooks and traps that I know. And there are some that if I keep making the same mistake over and over again, I'll learn, and then I'll be able to put it to my checklist. And it's keeping yourself aware as best you can. But again, it's as best you can. When you do I might do 7, 8 sessions, something like that. And if I don't keep myself rested, if I don't take little naps, if my brain gets a little fogged, I can start falling into route behavior. And then the traps are there, right? The traps are there. So it's whatever we do to self-regulate. Okay? I got to keep aware of this. I got to keep aware.
With others, before you ask second question, does anyone want to ask a question that hasn't already asked one? Please.
Dr. Schiff, I'm curious about your sort of energetic model of the inward and outward spiral.
Yeah.
And if that's something that was your own insight, or you took that in specific from Reich's work somewhere?
Well, I would not say insight, and it makes it broader, and it makes it, but, I don't know if I took it from, Reich talks about spinning wheel. I mean, the movement of energy.
Just made it horizontal.
Right, exactly. So there is, and it's, if you read some different psychological literature, you see that. There is something about spinning, but it's just the way I categorize it, and there's a winding and an unwinding. It feels like that. In some circles they talk about body oriented. They talk about unwinding. It's a very popular term, and because it's a felt experience. People work somatically. They use craniosacral work or something. You feel an unwinding. You feel literally that's a little more. That's magnified. That's unwinding with a microphone. Okay, but you feel a turning in there. So I think there's an actual biophysical process that's there, but
There are actually whole systems that are based on working in spirals. There's
Yes.
a system called gyrotonics.
Oh,
that
right,
works entirely
Entirely.
with spirals, and
Right.
there are systems of yoga that focus primarily on the spiral.
Right,
movement of
right.
energy.
So for these other systems, we're all touching. We're touching things.
Tom.
I guess just for completeness because you weren't explicit about it, excuse me, the whole role of contact in all of this is kind of what integrates
Yes.
all these different pieces, whether you're talking about the segments, the places things stop, where things are expressed and moving, everything, and the health of the therapists themselves. That's where you're going to get your latitude and your own flexibility in sensing and perceiving where somebody stops or moves.
Uh-huh.
You know, that's the thing that keeps it alive in the moment, so that all the theory and everything you study, you know, all that does is attune you to what's already there in yourself and in the other person. You don't, when you try to force that in, that's when you're being mechanical. Once you learn it and become attuned and you throw it out the window, then everything rests on your contact.
Yeah.
And then all that structure just unravels by itself. I mean, that's what Wright's discovery work. He just discovered what happens naturally, and the therapist just applies himself to that based on his own health and contact with the
Yeah,
moment.
it's a really interesting thing with that, and you're so right about that. And yet there are these, along with that, there are these, a lot of therapies which, you know, I go to trainings or I read about, they teach you all the things about contact, but they don't teach you the theories. You know, it's like they jump to the processes of how do we meet, but they forget about why we meet and what are those, you know, and that's and the way you said it was so wrong. You can throw it out the window, but if you don't have it to throw out the window, then you're out the window. You know, that's, you get lost in
Worse
that.
the patient.
Or worse, yeah.
But just anecdotally, Reich at one point, particularly when he was at the final development of this technique in aromatherapy, most of the doctors continue to stay very, very rooted in psychoanalytic jargon or connection, even as and he was always frustrated with that. And he was famously capable of saying, "You all want to know what they would be doing a case presentation, and he said, you all want to know what character structure you're dealing with." He said, "Give me a case, any case," and he said, "I'll give you an exact character analytic structure," and he would say, "And it's irrelevant."
Yeah.
He said, "Irrelevant." He said, it's just a bunch of names." He said, "If you're not present and you're not there and you're not watching it carefully, it's irrelevant, because what really matters is not the language, but watching the energy and knowing how to keep the energy moving and where the energy is and where it's not and where it's blocked." And that remains central. And he said, as long, and his admonition was, as long as you all stay concerned about the jargon, you're not getting what he considered his central discovery.
Maybe that's what Dr. Soley was saying to me. We're going to take a 10-minute break and then hear from Dr. Eric Weitzner. Thank you very much, Dr. Schiff.